What's good, YouTube? I know we talk about a lot of money on the channel, and I've had a ton of questions on deck lists asking, can I avoid playing Desires? Can I, try to find a way to make this deck budget? And I want to talk about the death of budget decks, and it really is a death in the sense that we now finally have back in the game staples, but they're really expensive staples. But the really cool thing about these staples is they'll find utility in almost any deck you play. So in terms of budget, I think there's going to be a new rise on what a budget deck is until we see some reprints. But I don't think we're going to be seeing any reprints too soon. So I do want to go over that. Yeah, Pot of Desires is still a $70 card. It fluctuates. Dimensional Barrier, it's got that price range going for it of 45 plus, usually 50. It's going to be very good against Junishishi/Zodiac, but when you try to find replacements for these things, they do not do the same thing if you're playing competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! If you're wanting to go to tournaments and win, you can win without these, but it's just much less likely, and you'll struggle a lot more. Opening an extra card is insane, and that's what Pot of Desires offers, and there's so many jokes about it, but it's just proven its way tournament after tournament. But I do want to go and look at what was budget, and where did it go, and why we've lost it, and then go into how you can reclaim kind of having budget decks by already having your staples. It's not truly budget because you still need these staples, but once you have your staples, I want to show you how you can get your decks for cheap if you're being smart and thinking about it. So let's go back in time. Full power pendulum format. Overall, this format was pretty intense. You had the pendulum deck being very, very expensive. Strikes were 70, Sorcerer were 70, and it ended very quickly. But even moving forward, the pendulum deck was still very expensive, whereas Monarch decks, the joke was you could rip open 3 structures in top, and this was actually true with Domain Monarchs. The decks that were abusing Domain Monarchs were extremely cheap. You're using 15 less cards in the first place, and extra deck monsters are almost always costly. But you look and you were able to have a second deck for cheap, you were able to practice against that strategy for cheap, and the main strategy you had to pour a lot into, but you couldn't use anything from your main strategy, the pendulums, if you were a pendulum duelist, and any other strategy like Cosmos or other decks you might be playing. And Cosmos were by no means budget either, and you weren't using pieces from Cosmo decks in either of these for the most part. So it was just kind of this landlocked, Monarchs are budget, there is a budget option and budget deck to play Yu-Gi-Oh! But it wasn't fun for a lot of people, and other people did have a lot of fun with it looking back, but it was a very frustrating deck to play against because it was kind of a field blocker, and it's like, did you draw that out? Did you not draw that out? So let's go ahead and move forward to some of today's decks. And we're going to look at Heroes, and we're going to look at Paleozoics. These are two strategies that are at the forefront of being in the probably best decks. Paleozoics have been knocking on the door. They've taken 2 out of the last top 4s at YCSs. Very good. And of course, Junishishi are coming out. There's only a month left of this format. But hear me out here. Paleozoics and Heroes share their most expensive cards. There's Totally Awesome. And Totally Awesome is kind of the non-budget piece that floats into here that both decks run. But let's say you have a Paleozoic deck already. If you've already went ahead and bought out this entire Paleozoic deck, how much is your hero deck now? It's not much. Bahamut's cheap. Dark Laws are cheap. Hero Libs are commons. Shadow Mists are cheap. You're probably looking at 50 to 100 to fill out the rest of the deck if you've already bought yourself an entire Paleozoic deck. And if you're feeling rusty or, old and want to change decks over and you've been playing Paleozoics for a bit, take a break, play some Heroes. It's not that much. Yes, there's a core cost that's very expensive, but once you've got your core cost all together, typically the next deck isn't going to be too much. Let's say you've gone ahead and got yourself a Metal Foes deck and an ABC deck. Well, how much is it if you're switching your cards back and forth between them to be able to play either or? The ABC deck outside of Desires isn't that much unless you're playing the Brilliant versions, but the rank 4 ABC and the Metal Foes deck, you're probably only $100 difference, the Metal Foes fusion monsters themselves, and some things like Boombukus and Painful Decisions. It's a $100 bill, and I know that's not cheap. I know that's not necessarily budget to a lot of you guys, but anything 100 or less, in my opinion, in the game of Yu-Gi-Oh, has been considered fairly budget when it includes extra decks. So, like, if you're paying $100 on top of your ABC deck, it's very possible to have yourself a Metal Foes deck because staples are a thing again. And, of course, it limits the kind of Metal Foes deck you can play. Like, Gofu Metal Foes, of course, would cost a lot extra because of Crystal Wing and other cards. Or if you're playing, you know, like I said, the Brilliant version of the ABC, that's another pretty penny, too. So, like, there are core versions, though. If you go and scroll through all of the top decks of the format and you compare some ABC decks with some Metal Foes decks, it would only be an $80 or $100 kind of exchange to be able to play the other. And that's where you've got to look if you want options, but you want to be budget. Yes, it would be nice to have every single option, but that's one of the few things about Yu-Gi-Oh! It is a trading card game. You trade your cards. And in order to be able to keep up, you've got to sometimes take the hits. And but players like options. They don't want to have to get rid of their ABCs completely to play Metal Foes or vice versa. Well, here's the option. You're going to have to restrict yourself to certain versions of the deck. Not so much with the other ones I mentioned, the Heroes and the Paleos. There's a pretty standard build of Masked Hero, totally Heroes. And Paleozoics, like, there are a few versions, but almost every Paleozoic is common. And it's a very, very budget deck outside of Toad and Strikes. But once you've already kind of got... And Desires, of course, if you're playing Desires, I assume. But after you've already gathered all that, how much is the Hero deck on top? Probably about maybe $50, maybe even less. Tear open 3 Hero Strike structures if you could still find them, or find friends who have Hero decks, because everybody seems to have a Hero deck, right? It's just, this is the future of budget. You're going to have your core cards, and you're going to have to find out what other decks you can turn it into for very cheap. What do you guys think about this? Like, I realize that budget has kind of gone away, but I think this is the next form of how to find budget anywhere. That's why I called this video the death of budget decks, because they are overall dead. These staples have killed what budget is and what it does. We're about to see a flattened format, but that's not for another whole month away. So how do you guys play budget Yu-Gi-Oh? Yes, you can top without Desires. Again, I want to stress that. But if you've already got your Desires, you know, you're very well set off to be able to play a lot of different decks for a cheaper range, because this $200 Enable will let you go find almost any other deck, period, for $200, and then you can start cycling in that power into many of your decks. So, again, I think budget just overall died from the advent of having, let's go all the way back here, having Desires and Barrier, like these kinds of cards, and wanting access to these kinds of cards. Yes, there's going to be staple-ish. Barrier coming up will be pretty much staple. Desires right now is, I would say, a staple. If you're playing without it, you're giving your opponent more power typically. But by having them, you enable other strategies to be able to play for cheaper, since you've already got them. Just move them through your decks. And again, I know everybody cannot afford this, and it really sucks. I wish everybody could play Yu-Gi-Oh! For super cheap. Everybody didn't have to rely on their friends for trades. But I really think, I really wish that everybody could, like, just kind of play whatever they wanted. But one way to do it is look for another version of the deck, like ABC Rank 4 Metal Foes or Heroes and Paleozoics. Like, look for that other version of the other deck that can be cheapest to turn over. It may not be the one you want, but it is something else. And if you don't want it, don't buy it. But if you're wanting to play something different for the sake of playing something different, that's when you do it. Thanks for watching, guys, and let me know how you guys play budget in the competitive scene and do well. Are you able to just avoid Desires and be some of those lists on my channel that topped without it, or do you think that you just need it to be competitive? And what do you guys do to change decks when, you know, you're circling around all these decks that you want to play? And do you just trade the deck you have for another deck you want? Or are you able to hold on to it just in case you want to go back to it and find the cheaper alternative of the deck you want to play?